The unseen corner of the empire. The rain had just started to fall over the Bay Area when Sundar Pichai, CEO of Alphabet Incorporated, sat quietly in the back seat of his unmarked black SUV. The world outside was blurry with drizzle, and the city lights shimmered across the car's tinted windows like fragments of memories. It was a rare evening when Sundar had opted not to go home directly after a day packed with high-stakes meetings and global conferences. Instead, he had chosen an unannounced visit to a place that had been secretly close to his heart for months, a small restaurant he had recently funded, but whose operations he had entrusted to a passionate young entrepreneur named Rajiv. This wasn't just another investment. This little Indian fusion eatery nestled in a quiet corner of San Jose was a dream project born from a desire to give back, to create a space that celebrated Indian heritage with modern sensibilities. More importantly, it was meant to be a platform for immigrant workers and underprivileged youth to find dignified employment, mentorship, and community. No one at the restaurant knew Sundar was coming. He had made sure of that. He stepped out of the car with only a hooded raincoat and a worn leather messenger bag over his shoulder. His security detail stayed discreetly parked at a distance, instructed not to follow. The scent of spice and warmth hit him as he opened the glass door, the golden bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the ambience was cozy, with soft tabla music mixing with the gentle clinking of cutlery. Fairy lights lined the walls, and the aroma of fresh curry and tandoor mixed with the faint scent of incense. He scanned the room. Couples laughed over shared plates, families leaned close across wooden tables, and a few lone diners looked content as they scrolled their phones or read books. Everything seemed in place, until his eyes settled on the far corner of the restaurant. Near the staff door, half hidden behind a column, stood a young female server, barely in her 20s. Her uniform was neat, but her shoulders were trembling. She stood rigid, facing the wall, one hand clenched into a fist and the other pressed to her face. Even from a distance, it was clear she was crying. Sundar's heart clenched. He didn't move immediately. Instead, he walked to the counter and ordered a masala chai under a false name. Ravi, the cashier, a lanky teenage boy, nodded politely, unaware of who was standing before him. Sundar took his chai and walked over to a corner booth, his eyes still flickering to the young woman by the wall. She wiped her face quickly and stepped back toward the kitchen, forcing a smile as she walked past guests with plates. Something didn't sit right. He could have let it go. CEOs of multinational tech conglomerates don't often walk into restaurants to personally investigate the emotional well-being of a staff member. But this wasn't about status or protocol. Sundar had grown up in a modest two-room apartment in Chennai, where privacy was a luxury and every emotion had to be swallowed in silence. He remembered watching his mother cry in the kitchen when groceries ran short. He remembered his father coming home late, silent and exhausted, carrying the weight of unpaid bills behind tired eyes. Sundar had lived through years of hardship before stepping into the dazzling towers of Silicon Valley. He knew what it meant to break down in the shadows. As the server returned to the front, he waved her over gently. She hesitated, then walked to him, a small notepad in hand. "Hello, sir. Welcome to Amara," she said, her voice composed but hollow. "Is everything okay with your order?" Sundar smiled gently. "The chai is perfect. But I was wondering if I could ask your name." She blinked, caught off guard. "My name is Anya." "Anya," Sundar repeated. "That's a beautiful name." "I'm Ravi. It's my first time here." "Welcome, Ravi," she said politely, though her voice wavered slightly. Sundar leaned in just enough to speak without drawing attention. "Anya, I don't mean to intrude, but I noticed you were upset earlier. I hope everything is okay." Her body stiffened, and for a moment, it seemed she might deny it altogether. But something about the gentle tone in his voice, the quiet sincerity, the lack of judgment, broke her defenses. "My brother," she whispered, lowering her eyes. "He's in the hospital. He's only 16. He collapsed 2 days ago, and the bills are already more than I can manage. But I couldn't miss my shift. I can't afford to lose this job." Sundar listened, silent. Not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man who once lived in a home with cracked walls and a mother who stretched rice to feed 4 mouths. "Have you told your manager?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "I don't want to seem unreliable. This job means everything to me. They gave me a chance when no one else did." Sundar nodded, swallowing the emotion rising in his chest. He could see himself in her, a younger version, full of fear but clinging to dignity with everything she had. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said. "I know it isn't easy." Before she could respond, a man stepped out of the kitchen, apron stained and brows furrowed. Rajiv, the manager and part owner. He scanned the room and called out, "Anya, could you come help with table 6? Sundar raised a hand. Rajiv turned, confused. "Yes." Sundar rose to his full height and extended a hand. "It's good to see you again." "It's me, Sundar." The silence that followed was thick enough to stop the clatter of forks midair. Rajiv's mouth parted in shock as recognition dawned. "Sir, I had no idea you were coming today. If I had known." Sundar held up a hand. "It's okay. I didn't want anyone to know. I just needed to see the place through fresh eyes." Rajiv's gaze flickered to Anya, who now stood frozen, her lips parted, realizing who she had been talking to. A rush of anxiety flushed over her, but Sundar offered her a calming nod. "I just spoke with Anya," Sundar said gently. "She's going through a difficult time, and she didn't want to risk her job by asking for help." Rajiv immediately softened. "I had no idea. I know you run this place with heart," Sundar continued, "but I think it's time we strengthen our employee support system. We started this restaurant not just for profit, but to lift people up when life pulls them down." Rajiv nodded solemnly, his pride melting into purpose. Sundar turned back to Anya. "Take the time you need, Anya. Your job isn't going anywhere. And I'll make sure we take care of your brother's medical bills." Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they fell openly, without shame. "No one's ever done that for me," she whispered. "Someone once gave me a chance," Sundar said. "All I'm doing is passing it forward." The restaurant was quiet now, word spreading among the staff that Sundar Pichai himself had not only walked in, but had stopped everything for a single tear. And so began a night that none of them would forget. A night where the lines between CEO and server, boss and worker, human and human, blurred into one simple truth. Kindness is the most powerful form of leadership. Echoes of grace in the kitchen's heat. The morning sun had barely crept across the foggy skyline of San Jose when Sundar Pichai found himself sitting alone in the corner office of the restaurant's upstairs floor, a space typically reserved for staff meetings, inventory reviews, and weekly business reports. It was the day after his unannounced visit, and the events of the previous evening still played in his mind with a haunting clarity. He had planned only to visit anonymously, drink a chai, observe quietly, and leave with the subtle satisfaction of knowing his philanthropic idea had found its footing. Instead, he had found Anya. Or rather, she had found him, with tear-stained cheeks, a fragile spirit, and a story that pierced deeper than spreadsheets and software ever could. He stared through the frosted glass, watching the early staff trickle into the building. There was a gentle bustle in the air, the kind that carried the heartbeat of people who weren't just showing up for a job, but for survival. Most of them were immigrants or first-generation Americans, some balancing 2 jobs and college classes, others sending money back to distant villages they hadn't seen in years. Each one had a story they rarely told. Each one was living the very struggle that Sundar himself had once walked through barefoot. Rajiv entered the room with a quiet knock, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a leather-bound notebook tucked under his arm. He had barely slept, overwhelmed by a mix of embarrassment, gratitude, and the sheer weight of responsibility that Sundar's visit had reawakened in him. "I still can't believe yesterday happened," Rajiv said as he handed Sundar a cup and took a seat across the desk. Sundar smiled faintly and took a slow sip before responding. Neither can I. But it did. And I'm glad. Rajiv looked down, guilt flickering in his eyes. I should have noticed Anya was struggling. I feel like I failed. No, Rajiv, Sundar said firmly. You didn't fail. You built something real here, something with soul. But when we start growing, we sometimes forget the corners that need more light. That's all this is. A wake-up call, not an accusation. Rajiv nodded slowly. I want to do better. Not just for Anya, but for all of them. Sundar leaned forward, his gaze steady. Then we start today. I'm not here as a CEO. I'm here as someone who remembers what it feels like to have potential but no platform. Let's create a model. A working, replicable blueprint for businesses that place human dignity at the center. And with that, a new mission was born, not just to serve good food, but to nourish lives. Later that day, Sundar made a decision that startled the staff and raised more than a few eyebrows. He requested to spend a full week working at the restaurant. No suits, no title, no special treatment. Just him, shadowing the staff, taking on tasks, listening, learning, and reconnecting with the rhythm of labor that had long since been replaced in his life by boardrooms and billion-dollar valuations. It wasn't for publicity. There were no cameras, no social media posts, just silent immersion. He began in the kitchen. The heart of any restaurant, it was a place of controlled chaos, sharp edges, boiling pots, and infinite pressure. The head chef, Mayor, a middle-aged Punjabi woman with arms like steel and a laugh like a thunderclap, was skeptical at first. You sure you want to do this, sir? She asked on the first day, her hands deep in a dough mixture. It's not exactly Silicon Valley glamour in here. Sundar rolled up his sleeves. I didn't grow up with glamour, Mayor. I grew up helping my mother cook rice on a kerosene stove. She grinned, handing him a rolling pin. Then welcome to the madhouse. The kitchen was a world unto itself. Every second mattered. Orders flew in from the front desk like digital missiles, and the cooks moved with the unspoken coordination of a seasoned orchestra. Mayor barked instructions in Hindi and English. Sweat dripped from brows, spices filled the air, and pans clanged like battle shields. At first, Sundar stumbled. His hands, more accustomed to touchscreen gestures and keynote presentations, struggled with peeling onions and flipping naans on hot tavas, but he didn't complain. He learned. He watched. He asked. And slowly he earned their respect, not because of who he was, but because he showed up, apron-tied, ready to work. During breaks, he sat with the staff in the alley behind the restaurant, sipping tea from paper cups and listening to their stories. There was Hassan, the dishwasher, who used to be an electrical engineer in Syria before the war. There was Priya, a line cook and single mother who wrote poetry on napkins during downtime. And there was Anil, the busboy saving every penny to bring his younger sister from Nepal. Their stories were stitched together by a common thread: resilience. Each one had crossed oceans of adversity just to stand behind a counter or serve a table. Sundar felt a growing conviction rising in his chest. These were the real builders of the world. Silent warriors holding up invisible scaffolding. Then there was Anya. She returned to work 3 days later. Her brother had stabilized, and thanks to the discreet help from the restaurant's emergency fund, replenished quietly by Sundar himself, he was receiving proper care. But something in her had changed. The weight she had carried alone now felt shared. She walked differently, spoke more freely, and even smiled at guests with genuine warmth. On her first day back, she found a handwritten note in her locker. Dear Anya, strength isn't in never breaking. It's in allowing yourself to bend and still rise again. Thank you for reminding me what courage looks like. Sundar. She held the note to her chest and breathed in deeply. She had never imagined that her quiet suffering could become a seed for something greater. By the end of the week, the entire dynamic of the restaurant had shifted. A suggestion box was introduced, not for customer complaints, but for staff ideas. Health insurance consultations were scheduled. Mental health check-ins became part of the management routine. A mentorship program was drafted where every senior staff member would guide one junior employee in personal growth, education, or financial literacy. Anya volunteered first. And Sundar, he returned to the headquarters the following Monday. But something in him, too, had shifted. In his next company-wide town hall, he spoke not of profit margins, but of compassion. He told the story, not naming names, of a restaurant, a crying server, and a moment that reminded him that leadership isn't about controlling outcomes. It's about empowering others to rise. The impact rippled through Alphabet's global offices. Employees began volunteering more. HR departments reevaluated policies. Executives took quiet notes. And in a small restaurant in San Jose, Anya stood behind the counter, smiling at customers, unaware that her tears had changed an empire. The blueprint of humanity. 2 weeks had passed since Sundar Pichai had left the restaurant, yet the moments he spent among its people still pulsed vividly in his memory like the rhythm of a song he couldn't stop humming. Back at the Alphabet campus, nestled in the heart of Silicon Valley's polished tech utopia, he sat in his expansive office surrounded by sleek architecture, state-of-the-art innovation labs, and walls lined with awards from decades of building the digital world. But something had shifted in him. A restlessness stirred beneath the surface of his usual composure, a silent yearning that grew louder with every email, every quarterly report, every sanitized meeting about growth and market penetration. The usual metrics of success, stock charts, strategic partnerships, user data, no longer felt like the only language worth speaking. Something far less quantifiable, yet profoundly more meaningful, had begun to demand his attention. People. It wasn't that he had forgotten about people in his rise through the ranks. It was that the higher one climbs, the easier it becomes to see only the view and forget the ground beneath. But in that restaurant, in the kitchen's heat, in Anya's voice trembling with pain, and in the soft-spoken dreams of immigrants trying to build a new life brick by brick, Sundar had touched the foundation again. And now he wanted more than a fleeting glimpse. He wanted a blueprint, something scalable, something real, something that could be integrated into the very fabric of how corporations functioned across the globe. So, in a meeting that stunned his executive board, Sundar announced the launch of a new internal initiative, Project Sparrow. Named after the small, resilient bird often ignored in favor of more majestic species, Sparrow was designed to support underrepresented employees across all Alphabet subsidiaries. But it wasn't just another diversity and inclusion campaign crafted for headlines. This was personal. He made it clear. This initiative would go beyond token representation and surface-level support. It would include microgrants for employees facing sudden life emergencies, mentorship pipelines sourced from real experience rather than mere titles, and cross-functional volunteer exchanges between departments to foster empathy across roles. Humanity, Sundar said during the project's inaugural presentation, is not a PR strategy. It's a responsibility. If we can design algorithms that learn human behavior, then we must also design systems that respect the human struggle. The room had been silent, not out of disbelief, but reverence. His words had landed not just as another executive pitch, but as a rare admission of vulnerability from a man revered for his intellect, now revealing the compass of his heart. But the journey wasn't just about implementing large-scale change. It was also about sustaining small ones. Back in San Jose, the restaurant had transformed. Word had spread, quietly but powerfully. Employees felt more seen. Anya had taken on the role of team mentor, guiding new hires, and even leading a weekly support circle for staff to speak openly about challenges they faced, whether financial, personal, or emotional. Rajiv, humbled by the events, began spending more time on the floor, asking questions and listening rather than just managing operations. Mayor started informal cooking workshops for teens from low-income neighborhoods who showed an interest in culinary careers. The walls of the kitchen, once plastered with only safety protocols, now bore pinned Polaroids of smiling staff, scribbled quotes of encouragement, and photos of family members whom they were working hard to support. One Friday afternoon, Sundar returned, not unannounced this time, but quietly. No fanfare, no entourage, just him and a notebook. He sat again at the same table where he had first met Anya. The restaurant was busier now, more vibrant. The community had begun to embrace it as more than a place for food. It had become a gathering spot, a symbol. Children did their homework in the back booths while their parents worked shifts. Students organized poetry nights, and immigrant storytellers shared their journeys during weekend open mics. It had become what Sundar had always dreamed, a hub of culture, care, and courage. Anya approached, this time with no trembling hands or forced smiles. "Welcome back, sir," she said with a genuine warmth that could only be earned through resilience. Sundar smiled. "I told you to call me Sundar." She laughed gently. "Sorry, old habits die hard. How's your brother?" "He's doing better. He started walking again this week, and he wants to become a doctor someday." "That's wonderful." A pause lingered between them, filled with the kind of unspoken gratitude that doesn't need to be explained. She sat for a moment across from him, setting down 2 glasses of sweet lime water. "I never thought this place could become what it is now," she said quietly, looking around. "I just wanted a job. I didn't know it would change my life." Sundar leaned in, choosing his words with care. "The truth is, Anya, you helped change it. What happened that night, it wasn't a weakness. It was the spark." She lowered her eyes, overwhelmed, but didn't look away. Instead, she nodded and took a breath of acceptance. It was the kind of moment that transcended corporate achievement. There were no metrics, no dashboards, just 2 people connected through truth. Sundar stayed through the evening, this time touring the entire restaurant again, not to inspect, but to witness. He met Priya's son, who proudly handed him a crayon drawing of the restaurant. He spoke with Hassan about rebuilding his career as an engineer in America. He watched Mayor joke with guests, her loud laugh now iconic among regulars. Everywhere he looked, there was not just activity, but meaning. He returned home late that night, exhausted but deeply fulfilled, carrying with him pages of notes not about business models or market trends, but about lives, hopes, and what it truly means to lead. Later that month, at a global leadership summit in Berlin, Sundar took the stage. Industry giants filled the seats, CEOs, politicians, economists. But instead of speaking about AI, cloud computing, or market forecasts, he told the story of a restaurant, of a girl named Anya, of a kitchen where tears turned into strength and silence into action. He spoke of a movement not built on power, but on presence. "The future we build," he said in closing, "must be designed not only for progress, but for people. We must architect not only efficiency but empathy, because in the end, leadership is not about being first. It's about lifting others along the way." When he stepped off the stage, the applause was thunderous. But what mattered more to him were the quiet nods, the eyes of strangers who suddenly remembered the people they had once ignored in the climb to the top. The realization, perhaps, that success is not what we accumulate, it's what we share. And in a restaurant tucked away in San Jose, where a server once cried in secret and a stranger listened without judgment, a revolution of kindness had begun. The quiet legacy of one voice. The winter air in California had grown colder than usual, though the sun still cast its golden rays generously across the hills and suburbs of the Bay Area. Inside Alphabet's sprawling campus, amid its open concept offices, AI testing labs, and self-driving car prototypes quietly gliding around the perimeter roads, there was a subtle but undeniable shift taking root. A change. He believed in data, yes. He believed in algorithms and infrastructure and market strategy. But he also knew that not everything worth building could be engineered in a lab. Some things, like trust, compassion, and dignity, had to be built in the quiet choices we made every day, especially when no one was watching. Later that week, he received a message from Rajiv, the restaurant's co-founder and manager. "Hi Sundar. Anya has asked me if she could run a community outreach program through the restaurant. She wants to help train young women from shelters and immigrant communities to work in hospitality. We can't afford it on our own, but I thought maybe, just maybe, this could be something Sparrow supports." The moment Sundar finished reading the message, his answer was clear. Not only would Sparrow support it, but they would model it. He immediately connected the restaurant to his new team overseeing global employee impact. Within 48 hours, funding was allocated. Within a week, legal and safety frameworks were drafted. And within a month, the first cohort of 6 young women from 2 local shelters began training in the same kitchen where Mayor had once taught Sundar how to knead dough. The program was simple in design but profound in execution. Participants were trained not only in cooking, but in customer service, emotional regulation, financial literacy, and job readiness. Anya led the sessions with calm authority, blending her own story into each module. She taught not from theory, but from experience. She knew what it felt like to be scared, to feel like the floor beneath your feet was always one missed paycheck from disappearing. And now she stood firm, no longer just surviving, but guiding. Word began to spread again. Local journalists wrote modest features on the program. A few community leaders visited the space, offering to sponsor meals or provide materials. But Anya insisted the focus stay on the participants. Not on her, not on the donors, but on the young women walking into that kitchen with trembling steps and walking out with heads held higher than they'd ever dared. One evening, Sundar returned for another quiet visit, not to be seen, but to observe. He arrived during one of the evening training sessions. The back kitchen buzzed with controlled motion. Chutneys were being blended, orders being called, and in the back corner, Anya stood by a young girl named Lena who was learning to hold a tray without spilling. Sundar stood at the edge for several minutes unnoticed. It was a rare pleasure to simply witness. When Anya saw him, her smile spread not from obligation, but from recognition. She came over with the casual grace of someone who had outgrown fear. "You always come quietly," she said. "I come to learn," Sundar replied. She gestured toward the young women behind her. "These are my teachers now." Sundar looked past her to the group. They were laughing, sweating, focusing, failing, trying again. It reminded him of the early days of Google, back when there were no guarantees, just raw belief and relentless effort. The same spirit lived here. He sat down in a booth nearby and watched as Anya returned to work. Rajiv came over a moment later and joined him, sliding into the opposite seat. "You ever think a restaurant could do this?" Rajiv asked. Sundar chuckled. "I didn't even think a browser could change the world." And yet, there was a long pause as they both looked out over the floor, filled with patrons, trainees, and the quiet power of what can happen when one life is treated as sacred. "You know what's strange?" Rajiv added. "It all started with her crying in a corner." "No," Sundar said thoughtfully. "It started because someone finally looked in that corner." And that was the truth that stayed with him long after he left the restaurant that night. In business, in policy, in society, we are often trained to look at what's performing well, what's shining, what's celebrated. But the soul of an organization, like the soul of a person, often resides in the overlooked corners. The people who stay late, who carry burdens they never speak of, who cry alone, and still show up with a smile. In the months that followed, Sparrow continued to grow, expanded into Europe and South Asia, partnered with NGOs, developed a digital app that allowed employees worldwide to anonymously seek help or mentorship. But even as it scaled, Sundar ensured it never forgot its origin. Every onboarding package now included a small booklet titled The Sparrow Story, and the first chapter was called The Girl in the Corner. At the restaurant, things evolved too. A new branch opened, staffed largely by graduates of the training program. Anya was promoted to program director. Meher wrote a cookbook with proceeds going to employee scholarships. Rajiv became a local speaker on ethical entrepreneurship. And tucked beside the counter, beneath the specials board, was a small framed note. This place was not built by hands alone. It was built by hearts willing to see each other. Customers often paused to read it, then looked around, some with softened eyes, some with smiles, some with a silence that meant understanding. Because now, more than food, more than fame, more than finance, this restaurant had become a sanctuary for second chances, a cathedral for quiet courage. And in the heart of it all was a truth Sundar Pichai would carry for the rest of his life. When you choose to see the invisible, you begin to build the impossible. Ripples across oceans. The year had quietly rolled into its final quarter, and while most of Silicon Valley was already planning holiday campaigns and preparing year-end fiscal reports, Sundar Pichai found himself in a reflective state of mind more than ever. In the grand halls of tech leadership, it was easy to drown in metrics. User growth, market share, quarterly earnings. But ever since that first unplanned night in the restaurant, where Anya cried unnoticed in the shadows, Sundar had begun to see something that could never be represented on a bar graph: the long tail of empathy. Project Sparrow, once a quiet idea seated in the soft soil of compassion, had turned into something far more profound. It wasn't a campaign anymore. It was a mindset, a culture shift spreading far beyond the walls of Alphabet. Other major tech firms had taken note, and some had reached out, eager to learn, to adapt, to replicate. But Sundar was careful. He didn't want Sparrow to become diluted into another buzzword initiative. He insisted that anyone interested in implementing it start not with policy, but presence. "Don't copy our framework," he had said to one CEO during a cross-industry leadership roundtable. "Sit with your employees. Listen to the one who cries in silence. Watch who eats alone. Ask the janitor how they're doing, not because of optics, but because you want to know." That's where this begins. In early November, Sundar boarded a plane to India, not for a business summit or investor meeting, but to quietly visit one of the first international pilot sites of Sparrow. It was located in a modest call center on the outskirts of Pune, far from the glamour of Mumbai's financial towers or Bangalore's tech parks. This center handled some of the back-end operations for various Google products: customer service, user feedback, content moderation. It was an environment typically filled with cubicles, headsets, fluorescent lights, and relentless scripts. For years, these centers had been viewed merely as functional support units. Few in senior leadership ever visited them unless there was a crisis to manage. But today, Sundar was arriving not to observe operations, but to observe lives. He entered the building under no grand announcement. His team had coordinated with the center's management to ensure the visit remained intimate, respectful, and focused. Accompanied only by 2 local team leads, he began walking the floors. The building buzzed with activity. Rows of young professionals spoke into headsets in various languages, explaining policies, troubleshooting devices, calming irate customers. Some looked up as he passed and froze, unsure if they had really seen Sundar Pichai. Others simply continued working, too absorbed in the tide of customer calls to notice. In a corner station, a young man named Vikrant sat with one hand resting over a small photograph pinned to his desk. Sundar noticed it, a worn picture of an older woman, eyes kind and tired. He paused beside the desk. "She's your mother?" Sundar asked gently. Startled, Vikrant turned, eyes wide. "Yes, sir. I didn't see you coming. I'm sorry." "No need to apologize," Sundar said, smiling softly. "Tell me about her." Vikrant's voice softened. "She's the reason I'm here. I come from a village outside Nashik. She sold her gold bangles so I could attend college in Pune. She raised 3 of us alone after my father passed. She taught me everything." Sundar listened, deeply present. "Has she seen where you work?" "No, sir. She's too old to travel, but I promised I would make her proud." "You already have," Sundar replied. "And from today forward, she'll be part of something much bigger than just this office." Later that day, Sundar sat down with a group of employees from different departments: customer service, night shift moderators, cleaning crew, cafeteria cooks. No suits, no speeches, just tea, biscuits, and conversation. They spoke about the mental fatigue of content moderation, about economic pressure, about dreams placed on hold, about families left behind. One woman, Anuja, confessed through tears that she had been battling postpartum depression in silence because she feared speaking up would result in losing her job. Another young man admitted that he took extra shifts not for money, but to avoid the loneliness of his rented room where no one waited for him. Sundar didn't interrupt. He didn't try to solve every problem on the spot. He listened with the kind of intent that told them their voices mattered, not because they were useful, but because they were human. From this visit emerged the Sparrow Trust Circles, a new arm of the initiative focused solely on emotional wellness and peer mentorship within global support teams. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't HR. It was simply a space, quiet, respectful, voluntary, where workers could sit once a week and be heard without the need to impress or defend themselves. The concept was simple, but its impact, like the flutter of a sparrow's wings, was transformative. Meanwhile, back in San Jose, the original restaurant had become a small but powerful epicenter of hope. Anya's training program had expanded to include not just young women, but also veterans, refugees, and formerly incarcerated individuals seeking a new beginning. Local colleges had begun sending culinary students there for field experience, not to teach, but to learn humility from Mayor and her trainees. The restaurant had quietly earned a reputation not just for its food, but for the invisible resilience baked into every meal. One evening, Anya stood before a new group of trainees, holding up a simple laminated card bearing 5 words: "We see you. You matter." It had become the motto of the program, printed on uniforms, painted on a small mural in the alley, even written on napkins slipped discreetly into takeout bags. Customers who noticed them often smiled and kept the napkins. Some posted them on social media. Others quietly tucked them into wallets, perhaps for reasons even they couldn't explain. Sundar returned to the restaurant one rainy afternoon, unannounced as usual. This time, he was greeted not just by staff, but by a group of children from a local shelter who were visiting for a storytelling session led by Anya. She read aloud from a book written by one of the trainees, a short memoir titled "The Table Where I Learned to Stand." As Sundar listened, surrounded by laughter, steaming food, and the scratch of crayons on paper placemats, he felt something shift, not in the world, but in himself. A quiet knowing, a peace. He stepped into the kitchen afterward to see Mayor prepping for the evening rush. She looked up and grinned. "You're becoming a regular." "I think I always was," Sundar replied. They shared a smile, and she handed him a ladle. "Well then, make yourself useful." And so, amid pots of dull, sizzling cumin and the rising laughter of people who had once felt invisible, Sundar Pichai returned to the work that had taught him more than any boardroom ever had, the work of listening, lifting, and loving without spectacle. Because what had begun with one tear in the corner of a small restaurant had now rippled into homes, hearts, and hope across oceans. And yet, the most powerful truth remained. It had never been about saving anyone. It had always been about seeing them. When quiet hands build lauded legacies. It had been almost a year since Sundar Pichai had first walked unannounced into the small Indian fusion restaurant tucked away on a quiet San Jose street, an evening that began with anonymity and chai and ended with a single life-altering moment of compassion toward a crying server named Anya. Since then, what had begun as a seed of quiet empathy had grown into a living, breathing movement that neither boasted nor sought acclaim, but touched more lives than metrics could ever fully measure. As 12 months came full circle, Sundar began to reflect not as a tech magnate, not as a public figure, but as a man watching the invisible currents of kindness stretch across the world in ways he hadn't predicted but now fully believed in. The global footprint of Project Sparrow had evolved far beyond Sundar's initial vision. By now, there were hundreds of trust circles running quietly inside offices, warehouses, remote workspaces, and community centers linked to Alphabet and its extended network. Dozens of community-led restaurants, inspired by the original San Jose model, had begun to pop up in urban and rural corners of the globe, places where people didn't just eat but healed. Sparrow was no longer simply an initiative. It had become a framework that asked the hard questions modern business often avoids. What if our metrics were measured in lives restored instead of revenue raised? What if our performance indicators included dignity, safety, and purpose? As the anniversary of that original night approached, Rajiv and Anya planned a private dinner at the restaurant to mark the occasion, not as a celebration of success in the traditional sense, but as a commemoration of a beginning that no one had anticipated. The guest list was intentionally intimate. Past and present staff, a few local leaders, Mayor and her extended family, and a few alumni of the training program who had since moved into new careers or opened businesses of their own. Sundar arrived just as the sun was slipping beneath the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and plum. He wore no blazer, no security detail, just a plain blue shirt, sleeves rolled up, and a tired but content smile. The restaurant was aglow with soft lanterns and the gentle scent of masala and ginger in the air. For a moment, as he stepped through the door, the memories of that first night returned with clarity. The bell's soft chime, the hush of conversations, and the weight in his chest when he first saw Anya crying quietly against a wall, believing no one saw her. But this time, there was no weight, only warmth. Anya met him with a hug, no longer timid, no longer unsure. She had grown in ways neither of them could have imagined. She now stood not as a survivor of hardship, but as a leader of healing, and not just within the restaurant's walls, but in lives far beyond it. As dinner began, Sundar took a quiet seat near the kitchen window, a vantage point he had always loved. Plates of food came out, recipes curated from across India, lovingly reimagined and named after the staff who helped design them. There was Mayor's memory masala, Rajiv's redemption rice, and a dessert named Anya's second chance kulfi. It wasn't a menu. It was a living tribute. One by one, attendees stood to share not toasts, but stories. Hassan, the dishwasher-turned-chef, spoke about how his time at the restaurant gave him the courage to return to school and get recertified as an engineer. He had now been hired by a local solar panel firm and was working on a project to bring sustainable energy to refugee camps. Priya shared how her poetry, once scribbled in secret on paper napkins between shifts, had been compiled into a self-published book, funded by a small grant from the Sparrow micro-mentorship program. She had sold out her first printing and donated the proceeds to a shelter for young single mothers. And then came Lena, one of Anya's first trainees, who now ran her own home kitchen business and mentored other women in the culinary arts. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her eyes shone with pride. "I used to think my story was something to hide," she said, her fingers clasped tightly around a folded napkin. "But here, I learned that stories are how we pass on survival. I'm not ashamed of where I came from anymore. I'm grateful, because it brought me to this table." As Sundar listened, his heart swelled with a quiet, almost sacred satisfaction. None of this had been scripted. None of it had been marketed. And yet it was all real, deeply, gloriously real. After the stories ended, Mayor clapped her hands and announced that she was retiring from her full-time post at the restaurant. The room gasped in disbelief before she added, with a wink, "But only because I've been invited to help open a new Sparrow kitchen in Amritsar, and they say my hands are still needed there." The room erupted in applause, and Sundar rose to embrace her. "You built this, Mayor, with flour on your hands and fire in your heart." She looked up at him, her eyes moist. "No, Sundar, you saw us. That's what lit the fire. As the evening mooned down, Sundar stepped outside for a moment of air. The alley behind the restaurant, the same space where staff used to take exhausted breaks, had now been transformed into a mural garden. Brightly painted walls bore images of sparrows in flight, cupped hands offering light, and one wall showed a faceless girl sitting on the ground, with a golden bell above her and a soft hand extended toward her. He stood quietly before it for several minutes, overwhelmed. Rajiv approached from behind. Anya painted that last month. She said it's not about her. It's about every person who ever believed their pain had to remain hidden in a corner. Sundar nodded, unable to speak. For all the stages he had stood on, for all the honors he had received, it was this mural in an alleyway, that he felt most proud of. Because it wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about what happens when someone chooses to care deeply, when power is used not to command but to notice. He turned to Rajiv. Let's make this permanent. What do you mean? Let's make Sparrow a foundation. Independent. Global. Not owned by Alphabet. Let's give it to the people who built it. Rajiv blinked, stunned. You'd do that? I didn't build this, Sundar said quietly. I just listened when someone finally let their pain be seen. Everything else came from them. By the time the night ended and chairs were stacked and lights dimmed, Sundar walked away not as the CEO of one of the world's most powerful companies, but as a man who had watched an invisible act of kindness become a monument to what humanity could achieve when dignity was placed at the center. The story had started with a single tear in a dim restaurant corner. Now it had turned into a legacy carried on the shoulders of people who had once thought they didn't matter. And yet, the world now knew they did. They always did. The day the silence spoke louder than words. The world had changed. Perhaps not in ways the headlines captured, but in ways that mattered more. Beneath the sweeping narratives of technology, politics, and progress, there had emerged something more subtle, more enduring, a shift that began with no press release, no viral campaign, no trending hashtag. It had begun, quietly, with a girl who wept behind a pillar in a restaurant kitchen. And now, years later, it echoed in the lives of thousands who had found their voices, their dignity, and their purpose in places that had once only offered survival. Sundar Pichai stood by the glass wall of a modest hall in Chennai, India, watching as the first graduates of Sparrow Global's new South Asia Academy lined up to receive their certificates, not just in job skills or entrepreneurship, but in something the world had too long undervalued: emotional resilience. He had returned not as a dignitary or a CEO, but as a man coming home. In the air was the scent of jasmine, street chai, and the warm spice of summer heat, thick with the chatter of families, children, mentors, and old friends. Some of the attendees didn't even know who he was, and for the first time in his professional life, he was grateful for that anonymity. This final event had been quietly organized, without the media, without the sponsors, without even an official stage. There were folding chairs under a tarp roof, hand-painted banners strung across wooden poles, and the sound system buzzed slightly with static. But the people here, the former orphans, street vendors, housemaids, dropped-out students, and displaced youth, were radiant. Not because of the grandeur of the event, but because they now stood with a clarity that their lives had meaning beyond struggle. Each certificate represented not just opportunity, but transformation. And the name Sparrow had become more than a word. It had become a belief, a way of life, a mirror in which people saw their own smallness not as weakness, but as a strength, a spark, a beginning. As the ceremony concluded, a young girl walked up to Sundar with a crumpled envelope in hand. She must have been no older than 10. Her blouse was faded, and she wore no shoes, but her eyes held an intelligence that pierced deeper than years. "My Akka told me to give you this," she said softly. "She said you helped her when no one else would." Sundar took the envelope, crouched down to her level, and smiled. "And what's your Akka's name?" "She's Lena. She was in the first training batch in San Jose." His throat tightened. That single name carried with it a flood of images. The hesitant voice, the unsure hands, the napkin notes, the laughter that slowly returned. He gently opened the envelope. Inside was a simple letter, written in careful English. Dear Sir, I wanted to write you this letter not because I owe you anything, but because I want you to know something before you leave this world one day. Not as a goodbye, but as a thank you. You didn't save me. You didn't promise me anything. You didn't fix the pain. But you saw me. And because you saw me, I learned to see myself. Now, I teach young girls how to do the same. Every time they falter, I tell them about the day someone noticed my silence and didn't walk away from it. You taught me that kindness doesn't need a microphone. It just needs consistency. And so, wherever you go next, please remember this. Even if the world forgets, we never will. Lena. For a long time, Sundar sat in silence on a bench near the back of the crowd, the letter folded gently in his hands like something sacred. Around him, people laughed, took photos, shared snacks from banana leaves, and celebrated what most of the world never sees, everyday people reclaiming power without spectacle. He thought of the restaurant, of Rajiv, now running a foundation that funded Sparrow-inspired projects across underserved communities, of Meher, teaching cooking in Amritsar while mentoring women who had escaped domestic violence, of Priya, whose third poetry collection had just been picked up by an international publisher, of Anya, now co-chair of the Sparrow Foundation Board, who had just returned from Geneva after speaking to the United Nations about grassroots empowerment through small enterprises. They had all built something from the embers of their own pain, but they had done more than build. They had passed it on. That night, Sundar returned to his childhood home, still standing, still small, still filled with the echoes of his parents' quiet sacrifices. The walls were faded now, and the street outside noisier, but inside, it was still the cradle of everything he was. He sat in his old room, opened a fresh notebook, and began to write. Not an essay, not a speech, not a business plan. Just memories. He wrote of the first time he saw his mother give away food they barely had, and how it planted in him the idea that some forms of wealth could never be deposited into a bank. He wrote of the way his father's silence taught him that integrity isn't shown in words, but in what you do when no one thanks you. He wrote of the way Anya's single tear had shattered a wall inside him he didn't know still existed. And he wrote of the sparrow, a creature so small, so often overlooked, but one that builds with scraps, sings in the rain, and never stops returning home, no matter how far it flies. By the time he closed the notebook, the city was quiet. Only the whir of ceiling fans and the distant bark of street dogs remained. He looked out the window into the dark, and for a moment, he didn't feel like a tech leader or a titan of industry. He simply felt like a boy again, holding the weight of a truth too big for his hands, but finally ready to live it fully. That the world doesn't change through noise. It changes through notice. Through the soft-spoken, unseen gestures that say, I see you. And that perhaps was the most powerful technology he had ever known. Not the lines of code that had shaped browsers and platforms, but the human capacity to reach across silence and say, you matter. Because in the end, the Sparrow story wasn't about Sundar. It was about all of us. The ones who dared to believe that small acts could build loud legacies. The ones who refused to let another tear go unnoticed. The ones who chose to see, and in doing so, help the world feel seen too.